In the latest saga of the war in Ukraine, Russia's threatening cargo vessels and attacking ports in the country containing wheat. This has rattled world grain markets amid uncertainty of the future of Ukraine's role in exporting the crop.
And it comes after Russia said it was pulling out of a years-old grain deal, which allowed Ukraine to export grain uninhibited across the world despite the war continuing. Moscow now saying the country wants better terms for its own food and fertilizer sales. With us now, John Jordan is a former senior naval intelligence officer. Victoria Coates is a former Trump deputy national security advisor. And welcome to you both. Thanks for coming on. John, if you could talk to us about the impact of this move by Russia. Really, what sort of controversy could stem from the decision to halt grain exporting from Ukraine?
Well, first of all, Emma, good to be here. 400 million people depend upon Ukrainian grain. Ukraine produces 10% of the world's wheat, 15% of the world's corn, and 13% of the world's barley. The Russians here are trying to put pressure on Europe to sever and undermine military support for Ukraine by raising prices in European markets. The downside of the Russians, however, is the people that it's going to hurt the worst is Africa. And Russia's sponsor, China, has huge investments in Africa trying to build goodwill there, a huge strategic initiative. So the Chinese are going to give the Russians a few weeks to let this work so as not to save some face. But eventually the Chinese are going to be under a lot of pressure to put pressure on the Russians to bring this to an end.
And retired Brigadier General Blaine Holt wrote a piece for Newsmax.com, Victoria, and here's what it is, titled, "Food is an imprecise but deadly weapon." Can you talk about that again, how this affects, again, not only Ukraine, but European nations, Africa, China's somewhat role as well? Where's the vulnerability here that is ultimately exposed?
Yeah, it's good to be with you. I agree with John. I mean, this is a terrible burden to place on some of the world's most food vulnerable populations, particularly in Africa, also throughout the Middle East. And so this just shows you what Putin has been willing to do since the beginning of this war in terms of using natural resources, both energy and food, as leverage against the international community. And I would just say, these are both areas in which the United States can do much, much more in terms of food production and energy production to offset Russian blackmail. And we could do that not through subsidies, but through deregulating some of the very burdensome climate regulations we've put on our agriculture sector, and then also on our energy sector.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Again, the idea that the U.S. could act in this very moment and also increase domestic production. But John, realistically, what's next for Ukrainian grain producers? Will they attempt to still go about their sales and their business despite these threats from Russia?
Great. So the nature of grain requires that it be transported by ship because that's the most efficient way to do it, by unit volume and unit weight. So that's no longer really an option unless the NATO wants to guarantee safe passage for Ukrainian hulls, which would likely spark a direct conflict with Russia. So they're going to try to ship grain in a less efficient way through train and truck through Eastern European ports. And that's going to work for a while, Emma. It's going to mitigate the impact of this. The impact of this is not going to be felt for really 3 weeks. And mark this tape. In about 2 weeks, there's going to be a lot of effort by Beijing behind the scenes squeezing Moscow to put this to an end. So they got a couple weeks breathing room here, and then the pain is going to be felt, and the Russians are going to be under a lot of Chinese pressure.
All right, that's John Jordan, Victoria Coates joining us live. We do appreciate the time. Thank you both.